I left India with one suitcase, 2 children I had to leave behind, and a husband who told me, straight to my face, that if I walked out that door, I should not expect things to be the same when I came back. I told him I understood. I didn't. My name is Ananya Sharma. I'm 34 years old, and for 3 years I did everything right. I worked every single day. I sent money home every single month. I paid off every debt. I built the foundation of a life I believed we would finally get to live. But while I was building it on one side of the world, everything I was building it for was quietly disappearing on the other. The calls got shorter. The silences got longer. And my husband, the man I had chosen, the man I had fought with and loved and sacrificed everything to build a better life for, stopped asking when I was coming home. I should have understood what that meant. I didn't. Not until it was too late. This is not a story about a woman who failed. It is not a story about a woman who succeeded either. It is something much harder than both of those things. It is a story about what happens when you do exactly what you set out to do, and come home to find that the life you did it for no longer exists. I did not grow up dreaming of leaving. That is the first thing I want you to understand. I was not one of those girls who spent her childhood staring at the sky, imagining herself somewhere far away. I was practical. I was rooted. I believed in the life I had been given, even when that life was hard. And it was hard, more often than not. I married Vikram when I was 22. He was 25. He was not a rich man, not by any measure, but he was kind. And back then, kindness felt like enough. His eyes were warm. His laugh was loud. He had a way of making a difficult day feel lighter. And in those early years, I loved him for that more than I could say. He drove an auto rickshaw. He had been doing it since he was 19, learning the streets of Kanpur the way other men learn a language, slowly, then all at once, until it becomes the only way you know how to speak. He spent 12, sometimes 14 hours a day behind the wheel, breathing exhaust, negotiating fares, waiting in lines at traffic signals that stretched longer than patience itself. He came home tired every night, not the tired that sleep fixes, the tired that settles into your bones and never fully leaves. I did my part too. I sewed clothes at home, salwar suits, blouses, petticoats, for neighbors and for small shops in our neighborhood. I had learned from my mother, who had learned from hers, and my fingers knew the work the way they knew nothing else. I would sit by the window in the afternoon, where the light came in at the right angle, and I would sew until my eyes ached. It was not glamorous work. It was not well-paid work, but it was mine, and I did it with everything I had. Still, it was never enough. That phrase, never enough, became the rhythm of our life together. Never enough money at the end of the month. Never enough patience at the dinner table. Never enough quiet in our small apartment, where the walls were thin and every argument could be heard by the neighbors on both sides. We fought about the electricity bill. We fought about the children's school fees. We fought about the loan we had taken from Vikram's uncle and could not seem to repay no matter how carefully we counted every rupee. Our children were the only thing we never fought about. Arav was 7 when all of this began. Mira was 5. If I close my eyes, I can still see them the way they were then. Arav with his serious face and his habit of asking questions no 7-year-old should think to ask, and Mira with her gap-toothed smile and her absolute certainty that the world was a good place. They were everything. They were the reason I got up in the morning, the reason I kept sewing when my fingers hurt, the reason I did not simply sit down on the floor and give up. It was because of them that I started listening differently when people talked about America. I had heard the stories before, of course. Everyone in Kanpur had heard them. A woman from a neighboring colony who went to work as a caregiver in New Jersey and sent money home every month like clockwork. A man from a village outside the city who ended up in Texas doing construction and built his family a proper house back in India within 3 years. These stories circulated like currency, passed from mouth to mouth, growing slightly in the telling each time until they became something almost mythological. I used to listen to those stories and feel nothing in particular. They seemed to belong to another category of person. Not me, not Vikram, not our life. But then something shifted. I cannot point to exactly the day or the moment. It was more like a slow turning, The way a plant turns toward light without you noticing until one day you look and it is facing an entirely different direction. The arguments with Vikram were getting worse. The money was getting tighter. Arav had started coming home with notes from school about unpaid fees, and I would read them at the kitchen table while Mira played on the floor beside me, and I would feel something cold settle in my chest. I started asking questions, carefully, quietly, the way you test ice before you step on it. I talked to a woman named Priya, who lived 2 streets over, and whose sister had gone to America 4 years before. I talked to a man at the cyber cafe near the market who helped people navigate visa applications. I looked things up online in the evenings, after the children were asleep, and Vikram was in front of the television, half watching cricket, half somewhere else in his own mind. What I found both thrilled and terrified me. The process was complicated, expensive, and uncertain. The visa requirements were strict. The money needed upfront, for applications, for agents, for documents, was more than we had saved in the last 2 years combined. And the idea of leaving India, leaving my children, leaving everything I knew, sat in my stomach like a stone I could not digest. But the numbers on the other side of that terrifying equation were impossible to ignore. What I could earn in America in a single month, even doing basic domestic work, even starting at the lowest rung, was more than Vikram and I together made in 3 months in Kanpur. 3 months. In 30 days. That number kept repeating itself in my head, over and over, until it stopped sounding impossible and started sounding like mathematics. I brought it up with Vikram on a Tuesday evening. I remember it was Tuesday because Arav had had a test at school that day and come home proud of himself, and I had been in a rare good mood, and I thought, foolishly perhaps, that the good mood might make the conversation easier. It did not. Vikram looked at me the way you look at someone who has just said something so far outside the boundaries of reason that you are not sure whether to laugh or be concerned. He said it was madness. He said we were not the kind of people who did things like that. He said I was dreaming, and that dreams like mine had a way of costing more than they were worth. I did not argue with him that night. I let it go. I cleared the table and washed the dishes and put the children to bed and lay awake in the dark beside my husband, staring at the ceiling, while his words echoed in my head. We are not that kind of people. I kept thinking about that phrase in the days that followed. I turned it over and over, looking at it from different angles, and the more I looked at it, the less I believed it. Because what kind of people were we, exactly? People who struggled, people who argued, people who loved their children and could not give them what they needed, people who were tired in a way that sleep could not fix. Why couldn't we also be the kind of people who tried something different? That question was the beginning of everything. I spent 3 months doing research before I said another word to Vikram about it. 3 months of quiet, careful, deliberate preparation. 3 months of conversations at the cyber cafe, of notes written in a small notebook I kept hidden at the bottom of my sewing basket, of long evenings piecing together a picture of what this journey would actually look like. Not the mythological version that circulated through the neighborhood, but the real version, with its real costs and real risks and real requirements. I learned that the most common path for women like me, women without college degrees, without professional credentials, without connections in high places, was domestic work, caregiving primarily, looking after elderly people in American homes, helping families with children, doing the kind of work that requires not a diploma, but patience, reliability, and a willingness to show up every single day and give everything you have. I had been doing exactly that kind of work my entire adult life. The only difference was that in America, someone would actually pay me a living wage for it. There were agencies that facilitated these placements. Some were legitimate, some were not. Learning to tell the difference was its own education, and I made mistakes along the way, paid a small amount to one agent who disappeared afterward, trusted a phone number that turned out to be disconnected, but I kept going. I found my way to a woman named Sunita who ran a small placement agency out of Delhi and had a reputation, verified through a chain of references I traced carefully for being honest. She was not cheap. Her fees were substantial, but the families she placed women with were real, the contracts were real, and the women who had gone through her came back or sent money home, which meant the whole thing was real. The visa was the hardest part to understand. The category I would apply under had specific requirements, specific documentation, specific timelines. Sunita walked me through it with the patience of someone who had done it many times before. She told me what to gather, what to say, what not to say, and how long the process would likely take. She also told me, very plainly, that there were no guarantees. The visa could be denied. The placement could fall through. I could do everything right and still end up back where I started, minus the money I had spent trying. I appreciated her honesty. It was terrifying, but I appreciated it. The money was the other mountain to climb. Sunita's fees, the visa application costs, the medical examination, the documentation, the flight, all of it together came to a sum that felt at first completely out of reach. But I had been living with impossible numbers my entire married life. I knew how to look at a number that seemed immovable and find the small pieces inside it that could, one by one, be chipped away. I started setting aside whatever I could from my sewing income. Amounts so small they barely registered, but they accumulated. I spoke to my older sister Deepa, who lived in Lucknow and had a bit more financial stability than we did, and I told her what I was planning. Deepa was the only person in the world I told before I told Vikram. She did not immediately support me, but she did not dismiss me either. She listened, she asked hard questions, and then she said she would lend me part of what I needed, interest-free, to be repaid whenever I could manage it. I wept when she said that. Not dramatically, just quietly, at the kitchen table, with my hand over my mouth so the children would not hear. It was the first time in a very long time that I had felt something other than alone in all of this. When I had enough of the puzzle assembled, when the money was partially secured, the agent was confirmed, the process was understood, the timeline was mapped out, I sat down with Vikram again. This time, I came prepared. I had written everything out in that small notebook, the costs, the projected earnings, the timeline, the plan for the children while I was away. My mother-in-law, Vikram's mother, had already quietly agreed to help, though I had not told her the full picture yet. I laid the notebook on the table between us, like a document, like something official, like something that deserved to be taken seriously. Vikram looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at me. He asked me if I was truly serious, not sarcastically, the way he had the first time, but genuinely, the way you ask a question when you already know the answer and are only asking because you need to hear it said aloud. I told him I was. What followed was the longest and worst argument of our marriage. It went on for 2 days. Not continuously. There were silences in between, hours where we moved around each other in the apartment like strangers, where we smiled at the children and spoke in careful voices and pretended that the walls between us had not grown as tall as they had. But the argument kept returning, picking up exactly where it had left off, like a fire that won't go out because the wood underneath is still wet. Vikram said that a wife does not leave her husband and children to go to another country. He said it was shameful. He said his mother would be humiliated, that the neighbors would talk, that people would assume the worst about why I was going. He said that my place was here, with my family, and that if things were hard, we would get through them together the way we always had. I understood his feelings. I truly did. And some of what he said landed in places that hurt, because it was not entirely wrong. There was real pain in the idea of leaving, real loss, real risk to everything we had built together. But I also heard, underneath all his words, something that I had been hearing for years without being able to name it clearly. He had already accepted the ceiling. He had decided, somewhere along the way, that this was simply the size of our life, that the struggle was fixed, permanent, stitched into the fabric of who we were. And I had loved him for his warmth and his laugh and his kindness, but I could not love him into wanting more. I could not argue him out of an acceptance that had gone too deep. So I made the decision alone. I want to be careful here, because I do not want to make myself into a hero of this story. I was not brave in any clean, uncomplicated way. I was desperate. I was frightened. I was also, if I am honest, angry. Angry at the years of arguments, angry at the feeling of running in place, angry at the smallness of a life that I felt certain could be larger. Those were not noble feelings, but they were real ones, and they drove me forward when the fear might have otherwise stopped me. I finalized the arrangements with Sunita. I submitted the visa application. I waited, which was its own particular kind of suffering. And then, one morning, with a bureaucratic flatness that felt almost insulting given the magnitude of what it meant, the approval came. I held the paper in my hands for a very long time. The night I told Vikram the visa had been approved, he did not explode the way I had expected. He went quiet. He sat in the chair by the window and looked out at the street below, the same street he drove through every day, the same sounds, the same lights, and he said nothing for almost half an hour. When he finally spoke, he said only this, that if I walked out that door, I should not expect things to be the same when I came back. I told him I understood, but I did not really, because the person who said those words was still my husband, still the man with the warm eyes and the loud laugh, and I believed, with the particular stubbornness of someone who has not yet learned the lesson, that time and money and the fixing of all our material problems would also fix what was breaking between us. I believed that the thing he was threatening was a consequence I could outrun. I could not, but I did not know that yet on the morning I kissed my children goodbye. Arav held onto my arm and would not let go for a long time, and I had to make my voice very steady to tell him that I would call every day, that I would come back, that everything was going to be better. Mira did not fully understand what was happening, and somehow that was worse. She smiled at me at the door, that gap-toothed smile, and waved as if I were simply going to the market. Vikram drove me to the bus station. He carried my bag. He did not say much. When I got on the bus, I turned to look back at him through the window. He was standing on the pavement with his hands in his pockets, watching the bus. Not waving, just watching. That image has stayed with me ever since. I have turned it over in my mind 1,000 times, trying to read what was in his face in that moment. Anger, maybe. Sadness, certainly. Something else I could not name. Something that looked, from a distance, almost like finality. The bus pulled away. I looked forward. America did not welcome me. It simply opened a door and let me walk through it. That is the most honest way I know to describe my arrival. There was no fanfare, no sense of arrival in the cinematic way I had perhaps, in my most private moments imagined. There was a long flight during which I did not sleep. A connection in Dubai where I sat in a plastic chair and ate nothing because I was afraid to spend money I had counted too carefully to waste. And then another flight, longer than the first, during which I watched the darkness outside the window and tried not to think about the faces of my children at the door. I landed in Newark, New Jersey, on a morning in February. The cold hit me the moment I stepped outside the terminal. Not the mild winter cold of Kanpur, which I knew and could navigate, but something altogether different, something with teeth, something that went through my coat as if it were not there. I stood on the pavement outside arrivals with my one large suitcase and a carry-on bag and the address of a woman named Mrs. Patricia Holloway written on a folded piece of paper in my coat pocket. And I thought, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, I have absolutely no idea what I am doing. A driver Sunita had arranged picked me up. He was a Tamil man who had been in New Jersey for 11 years and spoke to me in a mixture of Hindi and English that I found both disorienting and deeply comforting. He told me the cold would get easier. He told me the first 3 months were always the hardest. He told me to call my family as much as I needed to in the beginning, but not so much that it prevented me from building a life here. He said all of this in the tone of someone reciting advice he had given many times before, advice that had been given to him once by someone else, passed along like a baton in a relay race none of us had quite signed up for. I listened to everything he said. I stored it carefully. Mrs. Patricia Holloway was 78 years old and lived in a town called Westfield, which was quiet and clean in a way that felt almost unreal to me after years of Kanpur's beautiful chaos. Her house was a 2-story colonial with a garden that was bare and brown in February, but which she told me, with great affection, was spectacular in June. She had 2 daughters who lived in other states and visited on holidays and called on Sundays, and she had a hip that had been replaced the previous year and had not healed quite as well as the doctors had hoped, which was why she needed someone to help her navigate daily life. The cooking, the cleaning, the driving to appointments, the company. She met me at the door in a cardigan and reading glasses pushed up on her head, and she looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not immediately read. And then she said, "You must be frozen. Come inside." Those 4 words, "come inside," were the kindest thing anyone had said to me in 24 hours, and I was embarrassed by how much they affected me. I followed her into the warmth of her house and stood in the hallway while she took my coat, and I looked around at the photographs on the walls, the bookshelves, the Persian rug, the lamp casting its yellow light in the corner, and I thought, this is where my life is now. The work itself was not difficult, not in the physical sense. I had spent my entire adult life working with my hands, caring for a household, managing the needs of people who depended on me. What I did for Mrs. Holloway was not so different from what I had done for my own family. Cooking, cleaning, organizing, being present. The difference was the context. The difference was that here I was being paid, properly paid, in a currency that would mean something when I converted it. The first time I sent money home, at the end of my first month, after I had received my first payment and gone to a wire transfer service in town, I stood at the counter and watched the transaction process and felt something move through me that I can only describe as a kind of vindication. Not happiness, exactly. Not relief, exactly. Something more complicated than either of those. A feeling of, this is working. The thing that everyone said was impossible is actually working. I called Vikram that evening. He answered on the third ring. I told him the money was on its way. I told him the amount. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough to make me nervous, and then he said, "Okay, just that, okay." And I did not know what to do with that word, whether it meant he was grateful or whether it meant he had decided to receive what I was sending without letting it change what he felt about the fact that I had left. I talked to Arav and Mira after that. Arav told me about school with the methodical detail of a child who has decided that if he reports everything accurately enough, his mother will feel as though she was there. Mira told me she had drawn a picture of me and put it on the wall above her bed. I held the phone very tightly and looked at the wall of my small room in Mrs. Holloway's house and told them I loved them and that I would be home before they knew it. I believed that when I said it. I need you to understand that. I was not lying to them. I genuinely believed at that point that this would be temporary, a year, perhaps 2, enough time to clear the debts and build a foundation and return to a version of our life that had the breathing room our previous version had never had. What I did not account for was how time works differently when you are working hard and surviving and trying to hold yourself together in a place that is not your home. The months did not feel like months. They felt like a series of days that blurred into each other. Mornings with Mrs. Holloway, afternoons running errands or cleaning or preparing meals, evenings in my room with the phone in my hand, calling home, listening for the thing underneath the words that would tell me how everyone really was. I learned Westfield. I learned the bus routes and the grocery stores and the pharmacy and the shortcut through the park that Mrs. Holloway liked to walk in when the weather was good enough. I learned her preferences, how she took her tea, which television programs she watched in the evening, when she needed company and when she needed quiet. She was not an easy woman. She was direct to the point of bluntness, and she had opinions about everything, and she was not accustomed to softening what she said to spare other people's feelings. But she was also fair, and she was consistent. And over time I came to understand that her bluntness was not unkindness. It was simply the absence of pretense, which, after years of navigating the elaborate social performances of life in Kanpur, I found almost restful. She asked me once, about 4 months in, why I had come. Not accusatorially, genuinely the way she asked most things, with a directness that assumed you would answer honestly. I told her the truth. I told her about the rickshaw and the sewing and the arguments about money and the children's school fees and the loan from Vikram's uncle. I told her about the 3 months of research and the agent in Delhi and the cold morning when I stood outside Newark Airport and thought I had lost my mind. She listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And your husband, is he supportive?" I said that he was managing. She looked at me over her reading glasses in a way that suggested she understood perfectly well what managing meant, and she did not press further. But something in her expression, a kind of knowing, almost maternal seriousness, stayed with me for days afterward. Back in Kanpur, things were not exactly falling apart, but they were not holding together either. Vikram had received the money, And the loan to his uncle was being paid down, and the children's school fees were current for the first time in years. On paper, the plan was working, but the phone calls were changing. In the beginning, Vikram and I had talked every few days. The conversations were strained, often short, but they were there. Gradually, they grew shorter, then less frequent. Then, there were weeks where we spoke only briefly, and mostly about logistics, the money, the bills, the children's schedules. The warmth that had once been there, even in the worst of our arguments, was cooling. Not dramatically, not in a way I could point to and say, this was the moment. Just slowly, the way a fire dies when you stop feeding it, until one day you reach out to touch it and realize the heat is gone. I told myself it was the distance. I told myself it was the stress of a difficult situation that was nonetheless temporary. I told myself that when I went back, when the money was enough and the debts were cleared, and I could sit across a table from him again instead of speaking through a phone, everything would recalibrate. We would remember each other. We would remember why we had chosen each other. I told myself many things in those months. Some of them were true. Most of them were the stories we tell ourselves when the truth is something we are not ready to carry yet. The one thing I did not tell myself, the one thought I refused to complete whenever it began to form, was the thought that Vikram might not be waiting. The second year was harder than the first in ways I had not anticipated. In the first year, everything had the quality of emergency. I was surviving, adapting, learning. And survival has its own momentum, its own forward thrust that keeps you moving, because the alternative is to stop and feel the full weight of what you have done. The first year, I did not have the luxury of reflection. There was always something immediate to attend to, always another adjustment to make, always another small battle to win just to stay standing. That relentlessness, as exhausting as it was, also protected me from certain thoughts. The second year, I had found my footing. The work with Mrs. Holloway had settled into a rhythm I could navigate without thinking too hard. My English, which had been functional when I arrived, had grown confident enough that I could hold real conversations, understand jokes, catch the emotional register beneath what people said rather than just the literal meaning of the words. I had made 2 friends, both Indian women, both in situations similar to mine, one named Kavitha, who worked as a caregiver 3 towns over, and one named Reena, who cleaned houses 5 days a week and sent money to her parents in Kerala. We met on Sunday afternoons when our schedules allowed at a small Indian restaurant in the next town, and we drank chai and talked about home the way exiles talk about home, with a tenderness and a longing that was inseparable from a certain relief at being away from it. Having friends meant having time to think. Having time to think meant the thoughts I had been outrunning in the first year began to catch up with me. The phone calls home had dwindled to something I could no longer rationalize as normal. Vikram and I spoke, at that point, perhaps once a week, and when we did, the conversations had the quality of 2 people fulfilling an obligation rather than 2 people who wanted to hear each other's voices. He answered questions. I answered questions. We reported the relevant facts of our respective lives, and then said goodbye. The intimacy that had once lived in our silences, the comfortable kind, the kind that means you do not need to fill every space with words, had been replaced by a different kind of silence, the kind that means there is too much to say, and neither person knows how to begin. With the children, it was different. With Arav and Mira, I could still find the thread. Arav was 9 by then, old enough to sustain a real conversation, and he called me sometimes without prompting, just to tell me something that had happened at school, or to ask me a question about something he was curious about. Those calls were the best parts of my week. They were the moments when I felt most like myself, most like a mother, most like the person I had been before all of this began. Mira was 7, still young enough that her relationship with time was different from mine, still young enough that the distance between us was, to her, simply the shape of things, the way the world worked for her, specifically. She accepted it with a child's pragmatic grace, and that acceptance broke my heart in a way that her distress would not have, because distress I could have done something with. It was during the second year that I began to hear things in what Vikram did not say. There is a particular skill you develop when you are far away from someone you love, or someone you used to love, or someone you are not quite sure how to categorize anymore. You learn to listen to the negative space. You learn that what a person chooses not to mention is often more telling than what they do. Vikram stopped asking when I was coming home. In the first year, he had asked regularly, sometimes with frustration, sometimes with something that might have been longing. In the second year, he stopped asking. And that silence, that specific absence, lodged itself in me like something I could not remove. I asked Deepa, my sister, if she had noticed anything. Deepa was careful with her answer, in a way that told me she had noticed something she was not sure how to tell me. She said Vikram seemed fine, that the children were well, that his mother was helping as she had promised. She said all the right things and then paused in a way that I recognized, the pause of someone who has more to say and is deciding whether saying it is kindness or cruelty. I did not push her, not that time. I pushed myself harder instead. I took on additional work on my days off, helping another family in the neighborhood with weekend childcare, doing some sewing work for an Indian woman in town who had discovered my skills and had more alterations than she could manage alone. I was saving at a pace that had begun to feel genuinely significant. The debts in Kanpur were nearly cleared. I had opened a small savings account and was watching it grow with the focused intensity of someone who has attached enormous meaning to a number. I told myself, 1 more year. 1 more year, and I will have enough. Enough to go back and start something of our own. A small business, perhaps. Something that would give Vikram more dignity than the rickshaw. Something that would mean we never had to have those arguments again. 1 more year, and I would buy back everything the leaving had cost us. I was constructing a future in my head with great architectural precision, and I did not notice, or perhaps refused to notice, that the person I was building it for had already begun to leave the blueprints. Mrs. Holloway noticed things I did not. She had lived long enough and lost enough to recognize the particular expression of someone who is holding something heavy without admitting it. One evening in November, when we were sitting in her living room after dinner, she with her book, me with my phone, pretending to read something, she looked up and said, quite simply, "Ananya, what is happening with your husband?" I looked up from my phone. I thought about saying nothing. Then I thought about what it had cost me to carry everything alone for 2 years, and I said, "I am not sure." She put her book down. I told her about the phone calls, about the silences, about the questions Vikram had stopped asking, about the feeling I could not shake, the feeling of something concluding rather than pausing, something ending rather than waiting. Mrs. Holloway listened to all of it without expression. Then she said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "In my experience, when a man stops asking when you're coming home, it's because he's already answered the question for himself." I did not sleep well that night. I called Deepa the next morning, and this time I pushed. I told her I needed the truth, whatever it was. I told her I was strong enough to hear it, which was not entirely true, but was true enough. Deepa was quiet for a long time. Then she told me that Vikram had been spending time with a woman from the next neighborhood, a widow, that it had apparently been going on for several months, that his mother knew and had said nothing to me because she did not know how, that the children did not know. She was certain of that, at least. I sat on the edge of my bed in my small room in Mrs. Holloway's house, and I held the phone, and I felt something happen inside me that I do not have precise words for. It was not exactly shock, because some part of me had been bracing for something, though not necessarily this specific thing. It was not exactly grief, though grief was part of it. It was more like the sensation of a structure you have been leaning against suddenly not being there, not falling dramatically, not collapsing with noise and rubble, just quietly, without announcement, no longer being there to lean against. I did not cry immediately. I sat very still for a while, looking at the wall, listening to the ordinary sounds of the house around me. Then I called Vikram. He answered on the second ring. I asked him directly. I had spent years being indirect, years navigating around the difficult thing, years hoping the silence would resolve itself without requiring me to name it. I was done with that. He did not deny it. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said yes, in a voice so flat and so tired that it told me this conversation was not a surprise to him either, that he had been waiting for it perhaps, the way I had been waiting without knowing I was waiting. I asked him why he had not told me. He said he did not know how. He said the distance had made everything impossible. He said he had been lonely in a way he could not explain, that the apartment had felt different without me. that he had tried to hold things together, but that holding things together alone for 2 years was not something he had been built for. I listened to all of it, and then, very carefully, I said, "And the children?" He said the children were fine, that whatever happened between us, the children were fine, and he would make sure they remained so. I believed him about that. Whatever else had broken, I believed him about that. I hung up the phone and sat in the silence of my room for a very long time. Outside the window, November in New Jersey was gray and bare and cold. The garden that Mrs. Holloway had told me was spectacular in June was nothing but brown stalks and frozen earth. I thought about a Tuesday evening in Kanpur, about a notebook on a kitchen table, about a man who had said if I walked out that door, I should not expect things to be the same when I came back. He had warned me. I had believed I could outrun it. I could not. I did not go home immediately. That is the first thing people always assume when I tell this part of the story, that I dropped everything and ran back to Kanpur the moment I found out. But life is not constructed that way, and neither was my situation. I had a commitment to Mrs. Holloway that I took seriously. I had a savings account that was 3 months away from the number I had set as my goal. I had 2 children in India who were, as Vikram had said, fine, being cared for, attending school, sleeping in their beds every night, and who did not yet know that the architecture of their family was in the process of being dismantled. So I stayed. I worked. I finished what I had come to finish. But something fundamental had changed in me, and I felt it every day in ways both large and small. The forward momentum that had carried me through 2 years of difficult, lonely, relentless effort had been powered, I now understood, not just by necessity, but by hope, by the specific hope that everything I was sacrificing was building towards something, a repaired life, a better version of the family we had been, a future in which the leaving would be justified by what it had purchased. When that hope was removed, the effort continued, but the feeling underneath it was different, quieter, more procedural. I was completing a task rather than building a dream. Mrs. Holloway knew something had shifted. She did not ask me directly again. She had asked once, I had answered once, and she respected the boundary of that. But she was kinder in small ways in those final months. She made tea without being asked and left it on the table where I was working. She told me more often that I had done something well. Once, on a particularly gray afternoon, when I had been sitting very still for too long, she came and sat beside me and simply put her hand over mine for a moment without saying anything, and then got up and went back to her reading. That gesture cost her nothing and meant more to me than I could say. I called the children every day without fail. With Arav, who was now old enough to sense that something was wrong even if he could not name it, I was careful to be present, careful to be warm, careful not to let the weight of what I was carrying leak into his voice and become his weight to carry too. He was 10 years old. He deserved a mother who showed up for him fully, even across a phone line, even from a distance of nearly 13,000 kilometers. With Mira, now 7, I told stories. I had always told her stories, but in those final months, I told them with particular attention, particular detail, as if I were trying to deposit something into her that would still be there when I finally stood in the same room as her again. Vikram and I spoke less. What was left to say, in those months, was too large and too complicated for phone calls. We were civil. We were careful. We spoke about the children and the logistics of my return and the practical questions that needed answers, where I would stay when I came back, how we would explain things to Arav, whether Mira was old enough to need an explanation at all. These conversations had the quality of a negotiation between 2 people who had once been on the same side of a table and were now, without quite knowing when it had happened, sitting across from each other. I told him I was not coming back to end things in anger. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. What had happened between us, the distance, the silence, the woman from the next neighborhood, the slow erosion of something that had once been real, was not simple, and I was not interested in performing a simplicity it did not have. We had both made choices. His choices had hurt me. My choices had hurt him. The sum of all those choices, added together over years, had brought us to a place that neither of us had intended to reach. I finished my contract with Mrs. Holloway at the end of January. 2 years and 11 months after I had arrived in Newark on a February morning with a suitcase and a folded piece of paper in my coat pocket. She paid me my final wages and added something extra, which she presented not as charity, but as a bonus for work done well, in a tone that made clear she would not hear any argument about it. I accepted it the way it was offered, with dignity, with gratitude, without making it smaller than it was. The morning I left, she stood at the door of her house and watched me load my bags into the car. She was wearing her cardigan and her reading glasses pushed up on her head, exactly as she had been the first day I arrived. When I came to say goodbye, she held my hands in both of hers and looked at me with those sharp, clear eyes and said, "You are going to be all right, you know. It won't feel like it for a while, but you are." I told her I hoped she was right. She said hoping had nothing to do with it. She said she had lived 78 years, and she knew the difference between people who would be all right and people who would not, and I was unambiguously the former. Then she let go of my hands and went back inside, because she was not a woman who prolonged goodbyes. And I was grateful for that, because I was not sure I could have held myself together through a longer one. The flight home was nothing like the flight out. When I had left Kanpur nearly 3 years before, I had been so consumed by fear and determination that the journey itself had barely registered. It was simply the space between the life I was leaving and the life I was going toward. The flight back was different. I was awake for most of it. I sat with the window shade up and watched the darkness give way to the slow gray of dawn somewhere over the Middle East, and I thought about everything. Not analytically, not with the focused purposefulness I had brought to the planning stages of this whole endeavor. Just openly, the way you can only think when you are suspended between one place and another, belonging to neither, accountable to nothing for a few hours but the altitude and the movement and the thin, recycled air. I thought about Vikram, not with anger, not anymore. Anger had been part of what I felt in those first weeks after Deepa told me, but it had burned through relatively quickly, leaving something more complicated underneath. What I felt, sitting on that plane flying east toward home, was something closer to grief. Grief for what we had been at the beginning, for the man with the warm eyes and the loud laugh who had made difficult days feel lighter, for the version of our life that we might have had if the circumstances had been different, or if we had been different, or if any of the 100 small choices along the way had gone another direction. I thought about the children, Arav, who would be at school when I landed, and who did not yet know exactly what he was coming home to. Mira, who had my photograph on the wall above her bed, and who thought of my absence as simply the shape of things. I was going to have to be very steady for them. I was going to have to be the thing that did not move, the thing they could press against and feel that it held. Whatever was broken between Vikram and me, I was going to have to make sure they did not carry it. I thought about money, practically specifically the way I had always thought about money, because money in my life had always demanded that kind of attention. I had saved enough, not the enormous sum I had once dreamed of in my most optimistic moments, but enough to clear what remained of the debts, enough to put something away for the children's futures, enough to start something small without being desperate. The number in my account was not a miracle, but it was real, and it was mine, and it had been earned with 3 years of my life, and I would not apologize for that. I landed in Delhi in the early morning. I cleared customs and collected my bags and walked out into the arrivals hall and was hit immediately by the smell of India, that particular combination of incense and dust and humanity, and something I cannot name but have always known, the smell of the place that made me, the smell of home. My body recognized it before my mind did. Something in me that had been held tightly for 3 years loosened very slightly. Deepa had come to meet me. She was standing near the exit with a look on her face that was trying to be cheerful and not quite managing it. And when she saw me, she crossed the distance between us quickly and held me, and I let her. And for a moment, I was simply a woman being held by her sister after a very long time away, and that was enough. The drive to Kanpur took several hours. Deepa talked, filling the silence with the comfortable chatter of someone who loves you and is trying to ease you back into the world gently. She told me about her children, her neighborhood, a new restaurant that had opened near her house. She talked about everything except what we were both thinking about, and I was grateful for that too. I arrived at the apartment in the late afternoon. Vikram was not there. We had agreed he would not be, that the first meeting should be with the children, that we would handle the rest separately and carefully. His mother was there, and she opened the door and looked at me with an expression that contained so many things at once: guilt and relief and apology and the particular sorrow of a woman who has watched her son's marriage fail and knows that the failure belongs to everyone and no one. And she stepped aside to let me in without saying anything, which was the right thing to do. And then Mira came running from the back room. She had grown. That was the first thing I noticed, stupidly, obviously. She had grown, of course, she had grown. Children grow. But knowing something intellectually and seeing it with your own eyes after 3 years are entirely different experiences. She was taller. Her face had changed, had lost some of its baby roundness. She was wearing a blue dress I had never seen before. She ran across the room and hit me with the full force of her small body, and I caught her and held her and pressed my face into her hair and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that I was in the right place. Arav came more slowly. He was 10, old enough for dignity, old enough to have learned that need is something you manage carefully. He stood in the doorway of the back room and looked at me for a long moment, and his face did the thing faces do when you are trying very hard not to feel too much too fast. Then he crossed the room and let me hold him too, and his arms went around me with a tightness that told me everything his dignity would not let him say. I held both my children in that apartment in Kanpur, and I thought about everything it had cost to be standing there in that moment. The 3 years, the distance, the phone calls, the marriage that was ending, the version of myself I had left with, and the version of myself that had come back. Different, harder in some ways, softer in others, certain of some things I had not been certain of before, and uncertain of things I had once thought were fixed. The divorce came later. The paperwork, the conversations, the negotiations about the children, all of that came later, handled with the civil, careful exhaustion of 2 people who had run out of the energy for drama. Vikram and I are not enemies. We are something harder to name than that. 2 people who made choices, suffered consequences, and arrived at a place neither of us had planned for, who share children and a history and a particular kind of knowledge of each other that does not go away just because a marriage does. I started a small tailoring business. It is not large, but it is mine, and it is growing, and for the first time in my life, the money I earn has a stability to it that the years before never had. Arav helps me sometimes with the accounts, very seriously, with the focused diligence that has always been his way. Mira models the clothes I make, spinning in the back room with a theatrical flair that makes me laugh every time. I think about America often, not with regret, or not only with regret. I think about it the way you think about a difficult thing that was also necessary, a thing that broke something and built something at the same time, and cannot be neatly categorized as either mistake or triumph, because it was, honestly and completely, both. I think about Mrs. Holloway. I sent her a letter after I returned with a photograph of the children. She sent one back, brief and characteristic. A few sentences. Her handwriting firm and clear, saying she was glad I was home and that she had been right about me after all. I think about the morning I left Kanpur the first time, the children at the door, Vikram at the bus station, hands in his pockets, watching without waving. I think about what I was trying to build and what I actually built instead, and how those 2 things are not the same, and yet I am somehow standing in the middle of both of them. I went for the money. I came back with something I did not go for and cannot entirely name, a self that had been tested and had not collapsed, a clarity about what I was capable of, a knowledge that I could survive the worst version of the thing I had feared most. My name is Ananya Sharma. I am 34 years old. I grew up in Kanpur, in the state of Uttar Pradesh, in India. I left. I worked. I lost something I cannot get back. And I came home